let's get a little dirty. Hey plant people, my name is Sam and we're going to talk all about potting soil amendments and how to use them. So here I just have some basic pre-packaged potting soil, and you can see that it actually already has some amendments in there, but regardless of those amendments, regular pre-mixed potting soils tend to still need a little bit more aeration and drainage. So first, let me introduce you to some of our amendments and what they can do for you. So let's start off with perlite. Definitely one of the most common soil additives, and we've already seen it in our pre-mixed soil right here. Perlite is actually volcanic rock that's been heated and expanded, which creates a really lightweight and porous product. Perlite's primary function is to add aeration to the soil. So because of all of those little nooks and crannies, it has a lot of oxygen in it, and all of that oxygen going to your roots is a really, really good thing. It does help a little bit with water retention, but aeration is its primary function. Make sure to wet your perlite before you use it. Do you see all of that dust coming off of it? That is actually silica dust, and it can be a really big irritant for your lungs. So it's a good idea to wear a mask before it's wet. Some of the downsides to perlite is that it's so lightweight that when you water your plant, often it just floats right up to the top, which can be very, very irritating because it means that you're not keeping all of that good aeration evenly distributed through your whole soil. Another thing about perlite is that it has kind of a bad habit of accumulating and holding onto fluorides from your water and fertilizer. And this can show itself in ugly ways like brown tips on your leaves. So there are definitely some drawbacks when it comes to using perlite, but because it's so readily available and very inexpensive, it is hands down the most commonly used additive today. Now, perlite actually functions very similarly to something called pumice. Pumice is also a volcanic rock, but it hasn't been expanded, so it still has its weight to it. So when you're using pumice, when you water your plants, it doesn't all just float to the top. I personally love pumice. I think that it is definitely better than perlite, but pumice is a lot more expensive and sometimes it can be hard to get your hands on. But perlite is just so lightweight and weak that I can actually just crush it in between my fingers and it will turn to dust. Pumice won't do that. Pumice will keep its shape. Next is probably the second most common soil additive that we see, and that is vermiculite. Vermiculite is also an expanded volcanic rock, but vermiculite and perlite can almost be thought of as opposites. Vermiculite is like a sponge, and it can hold up to 4 times its dry weight in water. It also does add a little bit of aeration to your soil, but its primary function is definitely water retention. Whereas with perlite, its primary function is aeration, with the secondary being water retention. We use vermiculite in soil mixes where we want a lot of good water retention. We want to hold on to that water. So if you have a plant that's constantly drying out, you might want to consider adding a little bit of vermiculite to the mix. Because it's so good at holding water, we commonly use it in seed starting mixes inside the soil as well as sprinkled on top, because it allows the soil to stay moist and it's lightweight enough to allow for seeds to pop through. You can also use vermiculite just as an attractive top dress for moisture-loving plants, or you can make it about 1/8 of an inch thick, and it actually helps to prevent fungus gnats because they can't get to your soil, so they can't lay their eggs. Next we have sphagnum moss. So if vermiculite is a water sponge, sphagnum moss is a super sponge, and it can actually hold up to 25 times its own dry weight in water. This is most commonly used for orchids, usually mixed with bark, sometimes not, potentially some other epiphytes. You can also use this as an attractive top dress for any moisture-loving plants like alocasias. Now, sphagnum moss is often confused with peat moss, which is a common base for a lot of different prepackaged soil mixes. In fact, this one looks pretty peaty right here, but they are different. Peat moss is actually decomposed sphagnum moss, and it takes a long time for the peat moss to form, and it only forms in peat bogs. And the problem with that is that wetlands and bogs are very important ecosystems, and they're very, very fragile. So although I have used peat moss and peat products, in the future I'm going to be avoiding them and going for something else like maybe coco coir. Coco coir is a great substitution for peat moss because it is a 100% renewable resource. It is dark, lightweight fibers that actually hold a lot of moisture and is a great substitute for peat moss, and you can use it for your homemade soil bases. It's literally just the outer shells of coconuts. So it basically comes as a brick that you would wet yourself, and then it will expand substantially and you will get a lot of coco coir out of it. Next we're going to talk about lava rock. So this is just some red lava rock right here. You can see how incredibly porous it is. This lava rock basically functions like pumice or perlite, although it's nice and heavy and won't float to the top. But basically it's going to really help with your aeration, and it's going to just add a little bit of moisture retention. The good thing about lava rocks is that they come in all sorts of different sizes and a few different colors, so they give you some options. If you're interested in these products, I will try to find the links for you and put them down below. And then there's these clay pellet things. What are these? These are leca. Leca, also known as hydrogen, sometimes just called clay pellets or clay balls. But leca actually stands for light expanded clay aggregate. And although these aren't really used as a soil additive very often, they're often used as just a soil themselves for semi-hydroponics. So you can take like a glass vase, put your plant in there, fill it with leca, and then just put in some water. And that is actually a pretty successful home growing method. It's great if you're trying to get rid of bugs and fungus gnats and things like that. Because it has so many pores in it, it really helps bring the oxygen to your roots. So that's really good when you're doing semi-hydro. Don't forget to rinse your leca before you use it, just because it's going to have a lot of dust on it, and even through transport they can get dusty. So wash them before you use them. One of the great things about these is that they are washable and reusable, unlike a lot of things that we end up having to throw away after a while. If you're finding this video helpful, please go ahead and plant your finger on that like button. Okay, next, bark. So literally bark chips. And what these do is they add a lot of aeration and moisture retention for your soil. And these are very commonly used in orchid growing, like I said, mixed with some sphagnum moss, but also really commonly used in tropical mixes for tropical plants. For example, my monstera is definitely in a soil mix that has a lot of bark chips in it, same with my dracaena and a few other tropicals. So it really just gives it a really lightweight, super airy, free draining mix. One of the drawbacks with bark is that it is organic, so it does decompose over time, so it will need to be replaced after about a year or two. Okay, terpis. Terpis is just little pieces of fired clay, and they're great because they're heavier than perlite, so they'll stay evenly distributed within your soil, giving a good aeration, a little bit of extra water retention. And then over here I have some aquarium pebbles, just something you would use at the bottom of an aquarium. And basically these are just little rocks. They are not porous in any way. So they're very smooth, so they're not going to actually help you with water retention or aeration. So all these can really help you with is drainage, because they're heavy enough, they will stay evenly distributed within the soil and just give you good drainage. I don't really think you could just use these alone as your soil additive. You would have to use it as a mixture with something else. But the reason that people actually use aquarium pebbles is because it is so much cheaper than things like lava rock and whatever. So you could use half lava rock and half aquarium pebble and, you know, get a little bit more mileage out of it that way. I wouldn't really use aquarium pebbles with moisture-loving plants. Actually, I think the most successful use for these would probably be succulent mixes where they don't need too much water. So basically all of these are things that you can add to soil or any other base to help give your mix better water retention, aeration, and drainage. So here today we're going to be using this pre-packaged potting mix as our base, but you could be using peat moss or of course preferably coco coir. Okay, let's get dirty. Now that you know about the amendments and what they can do for you, you can start making custom soil mixes based on that. But I'm also going to give you some good ratio guidelines, and we're going to mix up a couple easy soils here together right now. So in my opinion, the easiest general potting mix for almost all of your indoor houseplants is going to be a 60-40 ratio. So you're going to use 60% your base, whatever that is, whether it's a pre-mixed soil or it's peat or coco coir, 60% of that plus 40% your amendments. So that could be 40% perlite, 40% lava rock, you know, whatever, or a mixture of them, but at least 40% so that you're adding lots of good extra grit and drainage. This is a lot more what we're looking for. We're looking for a lot more grit and a lot more aeration for our indoor plants. So it's this versus what we started with. You can just see the difference there. You can see how this one, although it has a few flecks of perlite in here, this one is going to be so much better. Now, something that's good to note is that if you're using a pre-mixed packaged soil, it is actually already going to have some nutrients in there. So I'm not going to be adding any nutrients to my soil today, but if I was using just peat moss or coco coir, I would want to add nutrients, possibly some compost, maybe a little worm castings, and I would want to add that probably around 10%. And so it would be 60% my base, 30% amendments, and then that 10% would be nutrients, so compost or worm castings. So that 40% amendment soil is really going to be great for almost all of your houseplants. But for succulents, I would actually recommend to basically do the same thing, but flip the ratio. So this time you're going to have 40% soil and 60% is going to be amendments. Because succulents are so prone to root rot and they really need free draining soils and not nearly as much nutrients or moisture, 60% grit does them well. Wow, so we can really see the difference there. Just by flipping the ratios, you can see that this is just so much grittier. It doesn't even seem to have a whole lot of soil in it, and realistically the succulents aren't going to need it. So this would be our soil mix for succulents. Very, very gritty versus the one we just made for your everyday houseplants. So there are some good basic mixes that you can use, and of course you've got a lot of the information, so feel free to switch it up and try out different things. I really hope that this information was helpful for you and that you make awesome soil mixes for your plants. I want to thank you so much for watching, and as always, take care of your plants and yourself.